The wind rolled in from the canyons like a warning, hot and mean, sweeping dust across the cracked earth of Dry Creek. The town sat slouched in the wide lap of a broken desert, where the sun never truly set. It only stepped behind the ridgelines to watch from a distance. Buildings creaked like old bones, and boots crunched dirt with the weariness of lives hard-lived. In Dry Creek, everything was sun-bleached, the signs, the cattle, the hope. At the edge of town, past the warped fence lines and scattered scrub, Widow Callahan's ranch crouched like an old dog in the heat. Modest, functional, no room for ornament. A faded barn leaned against a few stubborn cottonwoods, and the house, a squat thing with one front step and a rusted roof, hadn't seen paint in over a decade. Inside, Widow Callahan kept her silence the way some women kept fine china. Guarded, polished, too precious to break. 53 years carved into her face like rings in a tree, her hands sun-dark and calloused, her eyes a cool blue that had seen death and kept riding. She managed a handful of cattle and a pair of stubborn mules, enough to survive, not enough to rest. The folks in town called her strong, which was another word for lonely when it came to women out here. Her husband, Tom Callahan, had been gunned down in a poker dispute 15 years back. She never remarried, never even looked sideways at a man since. She did what needed doing, always had, always would. But even strength had shadows, and in Dry Creek, shadows moved on horseback. The Red Ridge riders had been pressing in like vultures, circling a wounded calf. Nobody knew exactly how many there were, 6, maybe 8. But everyone knew their mark. A blood red or burned into wood, or painted on a door, or left in dust like a whisper. They robbed small ranches, terrorized travelers, and once took a deputy's tongue just to prove they could. Sheriff Hobb drank himself quiet most nights, and the townsfolk followed suit, looking down whenever hoofbeats echoed too loud. There hadn't been a lynching in Dry Creek for 20 years, but every soul knew the riders could change that overnight. It was into this hot silence that the girl arrived, carried on the breath of a dust storm. It had been a blistering day, the kind that turned sweat to salt. Widow Callahan had spent the evening hauling water from the well when the wind kicked up sudden and fierce, driving grit into her eyes and sending the chickens squawking for cover. She just latched the barn door when she heard the faintest rustle, something softer than the storm, something human. She unlatched the door again, rifle in hand, and stepped into the hay-strewn dim. There, curled between the bales like a rag doll tossed aside, lay a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16. Barefoot, dress torn across the hem and sleeves. Mud and blood caked her legs, her hair wild and matted. She looked half animal, eyes wide, skittish, bones poking through the grime like they might give up on skin entirely. She didn't speak, just watched the widow with the stillness of someone used to hiding, used to being found. Callahan didn't ask questions. She simply stepped back, lowered the rifle, and said, "Come on, then." Inside the cabin, the girl didn't speak. She flinched at the fire, flinched at the clang of the kettle. The widow gave her stew, 3-day rabbit and beans, and watched as she ate like she didn't expect to see food again. She didn't ask where she came from. Not yet. There was time for that, if the girl stayed. Most didn't. That night, the girl slept on the old cot by the stove. The widow didn't sleep at all. Morning came clear, cool. Rare for August. The girl was up before first light, standing barefoot in the yard, her thin arms wrapped around herself, like she didn't know what to do with stillness. When the widow stepped outside, the girl didn't speak, just pointed at the coop, then at the pail. She collected eggs. She fed the chickens. Later, she found a mending basket by the door and began stitching a torn saddle blanket, like she'd done it all her life. She moved like work was safer than words. The widow didn't stop her. By noon, the girl had cleaned out the barn. Her hands were blistered, her shoulders red with sun. She hadn't asked for water, hadn't asked for anything. The widow filled a tin cup and handed it over. Still no words, but the girl nodded. A flicker of something passed between them. Not quite trust, but not nothing. Over the next days, the girl became a presence. Quiet, like smoke, like wind under a door. She did chores without being asked, moved with careful purpose. She didn't laugh, didn't cry either, just existed. Every now and then, she would pause, look out toward the canyon, eyes narrowing, like watching for something or someone that might follow. The widow, for her part, never pried. But she watched. She saw how the girl flinched at the sound of hooves, how she tensed when the mail wagon rolled past, how she never took her meals with her back to the door. Whatever she'd run from, it wasn't far behind. On the 5th morning, the girl finally spoke. The widow had just finished milking when the girl appeared at her side, holding a bridle in both hands like it might explain something she couldn't. "Fixed it," the girl said, voice like cracked leather. "Hope that's all right." Callahan looked at the bridle, looked at the girl, then nodded. "You hungry?" she asked. The girl nodded once, then looked down. "Good," the widow said, heading back to the house. "So am I." And just like that, the girl stayed. There was no name yet, no past, but something in her eyes had shifted. A thread of safety, of something mending. The town of Dry Creek didn't know it yet, but a storm of its own was building. And in the hay-strewn quiet of a dusty barn, something small and broken had just begun to stitch itself back together. He came into Dry Creek without dust on his coat or sweat on his brow, which folks found strange. Stranger still was the way he rode, low in the saddle, like a man used to distance. He wore a slouched hat that shadowed half his face, and a duster the color of dry blood. His boots were cracked but polished, and there was a long, clean scar running from the corner of his jaw to his throat, half lost in the stubble. He didn't speak much when he tied his horse outside Millie's boarding house, paid for a bunk and 1 week in coin without blinking. The register read Jonas, though no last name followed. People watched him. They always did when a man carried himself like danger wrapped in quiet. The older folks squinted harder. The war had taught them to recognize ghosts walking in skin. Some whispered he might be a bounty hunter. Others thought him an outlaw, maybe one of the old McAllen boys come back to settle something. Sheriff Hobbs saw him from the saloon porch and simply lifted his whiskey glass in a half-hearted toast. Jonas nodded once and kept walking. He didn't linger in town. Instead, he rode north each morning, out past the well, beyond the cottonwoods, and circled back around the widow Callahan's ranch like he was tracing the edge of something. The widow spotted him the second day, said nothing when he rode up and dismounted like he belonged there, just nodded at the barn and handed him a pitchfork. He didn't talk, but he worked. Strong hands. Moved like a man who'd done more dangerous things than shoveling hay. Didn't flinch at snakes, didn't blink at thunder. The girl watched him with sidelong glances, always from a distance. He never asked about her, never asked about the widow, just kept one eye on the horizon, like it owed him a debt. By the 4th day, he'd repaired a broken fence post, wrangled a stray calf out of the canyon, and greased the hinges on the barn door. The widow gave him stew one night, and he accepted it with a single nod. Still no small talk, but the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt shared. Dry Creek wasn't the kind of place that liked change, but it tolerated Jonas. The blacksmith offered him a spare hammer. The general store left a nail keg by the porch. Even Sheriff Hobb, in his drunken drift, muttered, "Better to have him close than guess where he went." Folks didn't ask what he was running from. They just hoped it wasn't running faster. Then the riders came. 6 of them rode into town like the law didn't matter, and maybe it didn't. Clay Maddox led them, lean and sunburnt, with teeth too white and a smile too wide. His spurs jingled louder than they should have, and his horse looked too well fed for the country's drought. They didn't rob anything. That wasn't the point. They just rode in slow, bought a bottle they didn't pay for, and made it clear they were watching. One kicked over a trough. Another slapped a boy's hat off, just to hear him cry. Maddox leaned on the sheriff's desk, looked him in the eye, and said, "Ain't you just a picture of courage?" Hobb nodded and didn't look up. They passed the widow's property on the way out. One of them, a heavy-set bastard with a jagged tooth, spit right on her gatepost and tipped his hat at the girl standing in the yard. His eyes stayed too long. The girl didn't flinch, but Jonas stepped out from behind the barn and watched them ride until they vanished into the scrub. He didn't say a word. That night, he sharpened his knife slow and steady under the porch lantern. Later, when the moon had risen and the widow had gone inside, The girl crept toward the fire Jonas had built behind the barn. She sat across from him, hands clasped in her lap, face shadowed. "They found us near Bitter Ridge," she said quietly. "My pa and me. We was part of a wagon train headed west." Her voice wavered like a string pulled too tight. "First we saw was smoke from the front wagon. Then the shooting started." She paused. Jonas didn't move. "They killed everyone. Least I think they did. I ran. Got caught. Don't know how long they kept me, but long enough." She swallowed hard. Her knuckles were white around her knees. "They got drunk one night. One of them tried to drag me off. I bit his cheek open and bolted into the dark. Ran for 2 days. Ended up in that barn." Jonas nodded once. "Ain't no one deserves that." The girl looked up, surprised at how soft his voice sounded. They sat in silence for a long while after that. Crickets sang. Wind moved the grass. Somewhere distant, a coyote called. "You ever gonna kill them?" she asked finally. He didn't look at her. "If I get the chance." "Why you helping us?" His eyes flicked to hers then, gray, tired, full of something that had been bleeding a long time. "'Cause I can." That was the closest thing to comfort she'd heard in months. The days that followed bent slowly into a rhythm. Jonah stayed on the ranch more often, fixed the well crank, dug a trench to redirect flood runoff. The widow paid him in meals and dry socks. The girl stopped flinching when he passed near. She even laughed once when he tripped over a piglet. One evening, as the sun dyed pink behind the ridges, the three of them sat on the porch. The girl sipped sweet tea from a chipped mug, her feet swinging above the steps. The widow dozed with her hat over her eyes. Jonas whittled a bit of pine. The girl tilted her head at him. "How come you never smile?" He shrugged. "Don't got reason. Yet." She looked at him a long time, then nodded like she understood. When he left the porch that night, she whispered to the sleeping widow, "He's staying. Even if you don't know it yet." And somewhere beyond the hills, where the riders coiled in silence and smoke, a reckoning took one step closer. It started with hoofbeats, thick and fast, echoing off the canyon walls like war drums. By the time dust kicked up at the edge of Dry Creek's single road, folks were already shuttering windows and locking doors. Horses galloped in, mean-eyed and snorting, their riders tall in the saddle and smiling like men who knew they'd never see a noose. The Red Ridge riders had come back. Clay Maddox rode at the front, lean, clean-shaven, boots polished like a banker's, and a long coat flapping behind him like wings. His black hat sat low over his eyes, but the smirk he wore was clear as a bell. He looked like a man who should have been a preacher or a salesman, but in his eyes lived fire and ruin. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office with the easy grace of a man unafraid. Sheriff Hobbs stumbled out, belt askew, smelling of whiskey and regret. His badge caught the sun. Maddox spit near it. "Evening, Sheriff," Clay said cheerfully, removing his gloves one finger at a time. "We hear tell there's a girl here who don't belong." Hobb tried to keep his voice steady. "Ain't no girl here but Millie's daughter, and she's 10. "That's so." Clay looked around, smiling wide at the silent onlookers, peeking through curtains and cracks. "Funny, 'cause one of mine swears he saw her, big as life, helping feed chickens out near the widow's place." "That ain't proof." "No," Clay said, walking slowly up to Hobb, close enough to smell the sour drink on his breath. "But we ain't here for proof." The town held its breath. Clay turned slowly, scanning the street like it was a parlor room. His eyes landed on the general store, the blacksmith shed, the water trough still tipped from their last visit. He chuckled. "Well," he said, mounting again, "let's give folks a reminder." He and his men rode out of town slow, like wolves. No gunshots, no blood, but when they passed the widow's ranch an hour later, they stopped. No one came out. The girl was inside, crouched behind the cellar door, breath caught in her throat. One of the riders took a pot of ash from his saddlebag. Another held up a plank, painted red. Clay walked to the gatepost, dipped his fingers, and marked an X across the wooden beam. The color ran like blood in the dry heat. Then they vanished. When Jonas returned from the canyon trail that evening, He saw the mark before he saw the house. He said nothing, just stared at it, long and cold, before turning his horse into the corral. The girl watched him from the porch, her fingers clenched into fists so tight her knuckles shone. Inside, Widow Callahan had already pried up the floorboards beneath her bed. The wood creaked like a groan from the past as she pulled free a long cloth-wrapped bundle. She sat on the edge of the bed and unrolled it. Inside lay a rifle with a pearl grip, its barrel dark with age, its wood smooth from the touch of a man long dead. "Tom used to say," she murmured, running a finger along the metal, "you keep something long enough, you'll always need it again." The girl stood in the doorway, trembling. "Teach me," she said. The widow looked up, surprise flickering across her face. But she only nodded and said, "Not me." They found Jonas cleaning his revolver in the barn. The girl stepped forward. "Show me," she said. He didn't answer, but he set down his cloth and stood, pulled a small Colt from his coat, and handed it to her. Light, worn smooth. She held it like it might break. He adjusted her fingers, one by one. They started with cans, then bottles, then knots on fence posts. He never raised his voice, never praised, just corrected. "You breathe wrong, you miss. Don't blink." Again. By sunset, her hands were raw. Her ears rang, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been in weeks. That night, townsfolk came one by one, whispered at the widow's gate, warned her, pleaded, "They'll burn your place. They'll shoot the girl. Maybe worse. She ain't worth it." The widow stood on the porch with her rifle slung low and her chin high. "She's mine," was all she said. Some walked away ashamed, others angry, but none offered help. As the moon climbed, the three of them sat around a fire behind the barn. The silence felt different now, like the hush before lightning splits the sky. The girl turned to Jonas. "You know him, don't you?" "Clay." He stared into the fire. His jaw worked once. Then he nodded. "Used to ride with him. Long time ago." The girl's eyes narrowed. "Why'd you leave?" He poked the fire with a stick, watching embers rise. There was a farm outside San Cielo. Poor folks. Just chickens and kids. Clay said they were hiding silver from a mine. Wanted to scare him. I said no. Rest of the boys didn't. He didn't go on. He didn't need to. The widow's face didn't change, but her hand found the rifle's barrel and held it like a memory. "Been looking for Clay since then," Jonas said. "Not for a bounty. Not for justice. Just to finish something that—" The girl didn't speak for a while. Then she reached out and placed her hand on his, small and steady. "Then this fight's yours," she said. "But I'll stand in it with you." He looked at her, and for the first time since he'd come to Dry Creek, he smiled. Just a flicker, a corner of the mouth. But it stayed. Behind them, coyotes howled across the canyon. The riders would return, but so would something else. Dawn came blood-red across the canyon. The sky stretched in thin, bruised light. Dry Creek held its breath as the sun clawed its way above the horizon. At the widow's ranch, there was no sleep left to be found. Only breath, dust, and waiting. They came in shadows first, dark spots on the ridge crest, backlit by the climbing sun. Hooves cracked over stone, iron-shod and heavy. The Red Ridge riders descended in silence, 10 of them now, not 6. Word had spread. The girl's escape had become an insult. This was no longer just about blood. This was reputation. Widow Callahan watched from the upstairs window, the long rifle laid across the sill, wrapped once in a blanket of memory. Her face was stone. Her hands, though aged, held steady. The room smelled of old wood and gun oil. The girl crouched in the barn loft, her cheek pressed to the warm grain of the ladder rail. A single-shot pistol clutched in her hands, the stock damp with sweat. She wore trousers now, boots 2 sizes too big. Her breathing came fast. She prayed between every breath, not for safety, but for courage. In the yard stood Jonas, hat pulled low, both pistols drawn. His coat hung open, catching wind like wings. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, and he stared at the dust cloud rolling toward them like a man greeting old ghosts. The riders halted just past the last fence post. Maddox rode forward alone. His horse was glossy black, nostrils flared, eyes wild. Clay wore a grin sharp enough to cut rope. "Now, I'll say this once," he called out. "You give us the girl, we ride out. No fire, no blood. You get to keep your cows and your silence." Jonas didn't move, didn't blink. "Last chance," Maddox said, drawing a silver-plated revolver and spinning it lazily on his finger. "She don't belong here. Never did." Jonas' voice came like gravel scraping stone. "She does now." The silence cracked. A single shot. Then thunder. Gunfire lit the yard like dry lightning. The riders charged. Bullets snapped through the air, tore into wood and earth. Chickens screamed. Horses reared. Dust turned to chaos. The girl fired from the loft, her hands trembling so hard the barrel danced. She missed the first shot, but not the second, catching a rider in the shoulder as he tried to loop around the flank. He dropped with a cry, rolled behind a trough, and didn't rise. Tears blurred her eyes, but she didn't stop. She reloaded, lips moving in rhythm. Breathe. Aim, squeeze. Widow Callahan fired from her perch with cold precision. 2 shots, 2 bodies fell. One sprawled across the fence line. The other twitched beneath the clothesline post. She never looked away from the scope, just chambered again and again. In the yard, Jonas moved like a man who'd never forgotten war. He pivoted, shot left, ducked right, rolled through dirt, and came up firing. One pistol emptied into a rider mid-charge, the other into the man behind him. He reloaded as casually as lighting a pipe. One of the riders broke through the corral and charged the barn. The girl screamed and ducked. Jonas turned and caught the man square in the chest. He folded backward, landing just feet from the barn door. But the riders were many. Maddox rode through the chaos untouched, lips curled in pleasure, eyes locked on Jonas. He dismounted, revolver in one hand, hunting knife in the other. Jonas turned to face him as the last shot clicked empty. "Well, I'll be damned," Maddox said, grinning like the devil. "Didn't think you had it in you to come back." Jonas, bloodied now at the temple, spat into the dirt. "Didn't think I had a home worth defending." They clashed like thunder. Fists, knives, grit. Maddox slashed Jonas across the ribs, laughing as blood darkened his shirt. Jonas struck back with an elbow, splitting Clay's lip. The revolver dropped in the dirt. They grappled. Clay was fast, but Jonas was desperate. Maddox got the upper hand, pressed the knife down toward Jonas' chest with both hands, grinning wide through bloodied teeth. Then the girl screamed. She was running, fast as her boots would carry her, through smoke, through noise. She flung herself at Maddox, driving the stubby knife she carried deep into his thigh. He howled, staggered, turned on her with fury in his eyes. But it was already too late. The rifle cracked from the window. A clean shot. Maddox's chest caved inward, his body jerking backward like a marionette with strings cut. He hit the ground hard, limbs twitching once, then still. Silence fell. Real silence. The remaining riders, leaderless and stunned, fled. 2 rode out injured. The rest vanished into the trees. None looked back. Smoke drifted across the yard. The chickens crept from hiding. Blood soaked the dust. Jonas leaned on the barn door, clutching his side, breathing ragged. The girl knelt beside him, her hands on his chest, crying freely now. Not from fear, but from release. Widow Callahan came down from the house slow, her rifle slung across her shoulder. She looked older than she had the day before, but taller somehow too. By midday the town came. They came ashamed, quiet, but they came. Some helped dig graves. Others brought cloth and water. The blacksmith carried 3 bodies out with his bare hands. Sheriff Hobbs stood in the field a long time before unpinning his star and leaving it on the porch. They offered it to the widow first. She laughed once, dry and low. "I've already buried 1 lawman. That's plenty." She turned to Jonas. He looked at it, held it in his palm like a thing too heavy for its size. Then he pinned it on. Nobody objected. 3 days later, the sky turned to rain. First in months. It soaked the land and washed the blood from the yard and roof. Flowers sprang up where the barn had been scorched. Chickens clucked like nothing had changed. The girl sat on the porch, boots on her feet, dressed clean, hair braided. She looked out at the hills and the sky and the road that led away from it all. Jonas sat beside her, his arm still bound. His coat hung nearby, the star catching faint glints of silver in the sun. He looked at her, quiet for a long time, then said, "This is your home now." She didn't answer at first. Then, with the softest smile, she whispered, "Yours too." And for the first time in his life, Jonas believed it.